fair one.
Well, hello and welcome to another instalment of the Frasers Perspective podcast. I'm Natasha Roberton. I'm here today with Ranna Alkadamani, the General Manager of People and Culture at Frasers Property Australia, and we're going to be talking about company culture. So, Ranna, maybe we begin with, what is company culture? What is it we mean when we talk about that?
Look, I think there's lots of definitions about what culture is, but when I think about culture, I think about shared values, I think about norms and expectations, and ultimately the way we interact with each other and how we treat each other. You know, just what it's like to work here.
Exactly. Why the emphasis on culture these days? Because, look, I can recall when I went through business school 20-something years ago, there was lots of emphasis on, in our training, how to read a balance sheet, the financials, having an analytical mind, you know, working on strategy. But there was never any emphasis on soft skills like culture building or working with people. What's changed and why is culture now so important?
Look, I think certainly when I started my career in HR over 20 years ago, I had a similar experience to you. I think over time, you know, we've learned that we measure everything in organisations. We measure financial metrics and many other things. You know, why wouldn't we measure culture? I think also our expectations of people, of ourselves and others has definitely evolved over that period. I think we expect more from each other in terms of values and demonstrated values, both in our communities, and I think that's reflected in organisational culture. So I think now the expectation is technical aptitude for leaders, things like understanding the financials or technical ability is the minimum.
Yes, table stakes in effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're looking for in our leaders now is this ability to develop a good culture, a resilient culture, a culture where people are their best version of themselves at work, and a culture that really is going to enable your strategy. Because that's the other thing. You know, the strategy is an important part of what we do in business, and to execute on that, you really need both a good culture and also good leadership.
You see culture, strategy and leadership as three elements that are intertwined for a successful organisation to move forward with its vision.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, I think they're all important factors. As leaders, our role is to facilitate a culture that enables us to execute on strategy. That secondly puts the customer at the centre of what we do in every part of our business. And thirdly, that gets the best out of our people. So people do bring the best version of themselves to work and essentially bring their A game.
So there seems to be plenty of examples of both good and bad culture in the headlines lately. I think about a company like Patagonia, which is the outdoor gear company with they've got a deep commitment to environmental sustainability. And they made a fairly high-profile political statement recently around their culture of sustainability by donating the entire $10 million of their Trump tax windfall, which they clearly perhaps thought they didn't really need, and they donated it to non-profits that are fighting climate change. And I thought that sent a very clear signal about that company culture at a customer level, a political level, and also at a business level. So that was very much a company living and breathing its culture and its values. On the other side of the ledger, I can think of some examples like Uber, which has a very aggressive win-at-all-costs sort of frat boy culture that in the end damaged its brand quite severely. And I think much closer to home, which we were talking about earlier, Ranna, was the Banking Royal Commission and the culture of greed that the Hayne report indicated had grown up around the banking system. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think they're both really, they're all really interesting examples. When I think about Uber, I think what's really interesting is that we don't have many examples in our history where a founder and CEO of an organisation has stepped down because of their culture. The CEO was quoted as saying, you know, that they needed to grow up in terms of their leadership style after a number of incidents and being called out for the behaviour. And I guess whether they explicitly or implicitly allowed this culture of harassment and sort of sexual harassment and intimidation, etc., to go on. The fact is that they knew about it and they also made excuses for it because they said that, you know, there were some high performers there in their business, and so that was just what people had to put up with.
Yeah.
A number of major investors called on the CEO, Travis Kalanick, to step down. And I think that was a turning point for Uber and for him in terms of his own leadership journey. Now, he's still obviously a major stakeholder in the business and, you know, he's still obviously called on to consult around their business model, etc. But I think it sends out a strong message to the leadership team of Uber and to other businesses around what people will put up with and what's acceptable, not just for employees, but also for shareholders.
Yeah.
And I think there's this obligation that we have not just to our employees, but also to our customers and shareholders.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. That value extends in a lot of different directions. The way company culture touches on staff happiness, leadership, resilience, shareholder value.
You mentioned earlier the Royal Commission into the financial services industry. And I think what's interesting about Commissioner Haynes' report is what sits at the crux of those findings, that culture was the root cause of this behaviour. That what he found was that the processes and systems that they had in place were in fact not the problem, that actually the culture was the problem. So it was this culture of really profit and sales above customer needs. You know, this culture of we'll do anything to get ahead as long as we meet our financial metrics. And it was interesting, you know, I read somewhere something about there was no metric about meeting the law and the legal requirements. And I thought that was just so ridiculous. Of course you wouldn't have a metric and you wouldn't reward a leader. The bare minimum of their job is to comply with the law and the regulations.
But so interesting that their culture meant that they ignored their legal requirements.
You know, and I think what that demonstrates to me is that must have been the way that people got ahead in that business. In these companies, you know, people saw success as this is the path to success. So you would do these things at all costs. And so I don't imagine that was written down anywhere, but it's certainly implied. And it's probably, you know, these are the people who got rewarded. These are the people who were promoted in the organisation. And so it just reinforces the behaviours that we reward.
I think you make a very interesting point there around culture being something that's not written down. And I would imagine in most organisations, Frasers included, that culture isn't a statement that's written on a poster and stuck on the wall and somehow everybody connects with it. It's really much more organic than that, isn't it? What's your experience at Frasers? I know from my perspective, I'm in at your offices in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane on a reasonably regular basis, and I've had the opportunity to observe Frasers Property's culture up close, and my impression is that it's one of openness and collaboration and a respect for diversity and a passion for ideas. I guess my question is, has it always been that way, and how do you transmit the right culture?
You raised some interesting points there. And in terms of one of those points you raised was around, you know, what do we write down in terms of culture? Well, we don't write down so much about our culture. We do articulate our values that underpin our culture. But I think that's just a bare minimum. I think it's more important around, you know, the role modelling, around what people see. You know, what are the actions of leaders and the people in our organisation? I had this moment last week where quite a senior leader called me about an employee matter that was going on in the business. And he opened the conversation by saying something to the effect of, this decision we make right now with this employee is going to speak to our culture. People are going to look at this and this speaks to our values and culture. And for me to hear that from a leader was such a good feeling. I felt like, wow, you know, we really are making some traction and momentum here. When leaders stop and think about decisions they make and how that impacts the culture of an organisation, to me is just a great moment in terms of how we treat people.
Yeah, I agree. And to my previous question, because there was a lot packed into that last question, has Frasers always been a collaborative, culture-driven, people, humanist-centric organisation, or has that been a process over the last little while?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been a process. When I joined the organisation, look, we were certainly not a bad place to work. I think we always had quite a paternalistic culture. But I think what's evolved over the last 10 years is that we've become far more educated in, you know, what are the elements of a good culture and what does it look like, you know, and what does it mean? We've gone from a culture that has been a highly defensive culture, one where, you know, people blamed each other when things went wrong, a culture where it was seen to be good to point out mistakes and be very oppositional and critique each other, was seen as a way to get the best outcome. And so people were highly oppositional. You know, the first time we measured our culture around 10 years ago, that I think was our primary style. So fast forward 10 years, and I think what I've seen in the last 4 years particularly, you know, we've moved to a culture that has become far more collaborative. one where we work together to get the best outcome. And we don't do that by, picking at each other's flaws or looking at who to blame for things. We do that instead by looking at what's the best outcome and how do we get the best out of each other and just working together. I think there's been a much greater focus on being a culture that is humanistic, encouraging. As you said, that's now our primary style. And when you think about cultures that are humanistic, encouraging, these are cultures which put people at the centre of what they do, and it's very much a development culture and really helping people to achieve in that culture. So certainly there's great accountability and responsibility, but there's also clarity of what people are working towards and this sense of a shared purpose and connection. So I think that's what we do a lot better now.
I find it fascinating that you've seen that evolution over 10 years from, a culture that was more characteristic of competitiveness and perhaps conflict to one that's highly collaborative and really built on teamwork. The thing that I find extraordinary about that is that I know, having worked with you guys for a little while now, that a lot of people who work for Frasers have worked for Frasers for a long time. So it's not like that changed because you suddenly hired a whole bunch of new people. Some of the people that would have done that survey 10 years ago are still doing that survey now, and yet they've personally changed their style from perhaps critical to collaborative. Why? What have you put that down to?
Look, I think absolutely you're right. We've got a lot of people here 10 years down the track, including myself. I think we've been on a journey of learning. So I think we've learnt about ourselves. And I think one of the most interesting things when you work on culture, you have to work on yourself. And as a leader in the business, I think our leaders have really embraced that. And I think that shows in the culture that we now have. You can't work on culture without working on yourself. We've invested heavily in leadership development in that space so that we can all be better leaders.
So it seems to me that the key there is it can't just come from the top down. It has to come from everybody. So you have to have a preparedness to work on yourself as well as sort of work toward the organisation's common goals. Talk to me about why we should care about company culture and creating a great one to work in. What are the benefits? What are the real benefits to the organisation?
Yeah. Look, Natasha, in terms of what we do when we measure culture, we use this very rigorous tool called an OCI Circumplex, but we also use another survey which gives us the feedback on what are the causal elements, so what gives us the culture we want, but also the outcomes. So as a result of this culture, what are some of the outcomes? So we've been tracking also over the last 10 years things like satisfaction, in terms of employee satisfaction, their intention to stay with the organisation, things around motivation. So for us, these are really important metrics around performance. They're just as important as our financial metrics in the organisation. So this is kind of like the health and well-being of our people. What is it like for them to work with us, and what do they tell people? And do they want to stay? So these are really key things for us. And I think we've certainly seen a vast improvement in those outcomes over the last 10 years. And they're reasons why we want to work on culture. But also cultures where people really value each other internally, I think are the cultures that deliver value to the customer. Because if you don't respect each other, how can you respect the customer?
I think that's a great point.
How would you have empathy towards your customer, regardless of the product or service you're delivering? So I think it starts with ourselves and how we treat each other, and then that's amplified in terms of how we treat our customers and stakeholders externally.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. So for you, if I was summing that up, you're suggesting there that to sustain a customer-centric focus and use that to your advantage, you really have to have a great culture. Otherwise, you're probably phoning it in or you're doing it for the wrong reasons.
Absolutely. I think there's a real big difference for people to feel it from the heart, from inside. And I think that's what culture is. It's the heart and soul of the organisation. So, yeah, you can't fake that, and you certainly can't fake it over a long period of time.
One of the things you mentioned earlier I was very interested in it was the word resilience. Can you explain to me what you mean by resilience in a company culture and why that's important?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, when we work on our culture, one of the things that I'm always thinking about is how do we develop and sustain a resilient culture, because the property market is up and down. Different sectors of the property market can change. When you have great sales momentum and consumer demand, for housing, for example, in a particular city, then I think it makes the job of the leader and the job of culture a lot easier. Because
you're riding a bit of a wave.
Yeah, absolutely. People are buoyed by that, and that has a positive momentum sort of impact, I think, on your culture. Now, the challenge with that is that if that's the only thing you rely on to have a good culture and a culture where people enjoy coming to work and develop the best outcomes, then you've got nothing to stand on really
when things get tough.
Yeah, when the market turns. And so, when I look at our culture, we split up our results across all our geographies and business units, etc. So there's over 20 subgroups in our company results. I've been really interested over the last few years in tracking the culture of our business teams that are in geographies that are quite flat, where they've really not had any sales momentum to buoy their results. And what I'm really pleased to see is that in some of those business units where they've made a very focused effort to work on their culture, they've been able to achieve outstanding improvements in flat markets. And so their results, and their improvements in culture have nothing to do with market momentum, and in fact have come in spite of flat trading conditions over a 2-year period. And so for me, that really demonstrates a resilient culture.
Okay, so that's a fascinating example. What do you put that down to?
So if I think about one of our business units in terms of what they've worked on in working on their culture, there's lots of things they've focused on, but 3 key focus areas that I believe have really made a difference in improving their culture. Number 1, being really clear on the goals for the business unit and articulating those in a way that's meaningful for individuals in their roles. So rather than simply saying, look, we need to increase profit by X million dollars, or we need to have our leveraging at a certain percentage, most people can't connect to that in their day-to-day jobs. They've really distilled it to language like, we need to sell X number of properties, or we need to transact on this many properties, or we need to finish building stage 2 of this project by this date. So it's stuff that people can relate to and understand, and they've done that in a way that involves people in their business. And they also, second part of that is really that they celebrate these wins. So once they've articulated these goals, they've got clearly established milestones in each of these. So whilst they're in a flat market, there's still things that they can celebrate. There's still milestones and achievements along the way. There's a reason to turn up to work every day. So I think it's important to make sure that people see that in those businesses. And I think the third thing is, as a leadership team, they've been extremely united and very clear on their roles as leaders. And I think that's really important, because what people see is this great sense of calm when they look to their leaders and people who are responsive in that culture. And the other thing is, I think the leaders support each other in a way that is highly affiliative and just is a real good demonstration of our collaborative culture.
All right, terrific. So before we finish up, Ranna, any last thoughts on how companies can build a strong culture?
Look, I think there are 2 or 3 things I'd like to leave people with in terms of culture. And the first is the role of the leader is critical in developing a sustainable and constructive culture. I think all eyes are on the leader, and they have both an opportunity but also an obligation to develop a constructive culture, I think. The second thing is, look, whilst everyone is not a leader of teams of people necessarily in the business, everyone has their own personal leadership that they're accountable for. And everyone has, I think, an opportunity to impact culture in the way they treat each other at work. So I think that's the second thing. And lastly, working on culture is a journey. I think you've got to put in both the hard yards and the long haul view to get an outcome over time. So it's something that requires a lot of persistence, I think, and certainly has been worth it for us.
Wonderful. I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Ranna.
Until
next time, you've been listening to Frasers Perspective podcasts.
Thanks.